And to tell you a little bit more about Blue Tower Training, since 2000 we provide training, consulting, and resource development in a variety of areas, including self-advocacy, violence prevention, response, and intervention related to that: safety, healing, and justice, working with collaborative teams. I'm currently on 3 of those. Inspirational keynotes, healthy sexuality, systems change, and the list really goes on and on. The audiences that we work with include disability agencies, people with disabilities, victim services, adult protective services, criminal justice, both law enforcement and prosecutors primarily, parent groups, advocacy organizations, and others, educational entities. And we do this training in community, state, national, and international areas. So that's just to give you a little more information about us. So before we begin, I'd like everybody to take kind of a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, just to get us grounded. We've been working really hard and busy today, so it's really important that we create an environment where we can all feel safe. We're going to be talking about some really hurtful things that have happened to folks with disabilities, and we know that those things happen to all of us, potentially. And so we want to make sure that everyone on the webinar feels like they have permission to take care of themselves. So if something is said and it triggers a memory in you or makes you feel uncomfortable, we want you to do what you need to do to feel safe. So if you need to put your head down or take some breaths or get up and walk, if you need to leave and come back, those are all fine, because it's really important that we all learn how to take care of ourselves, especially if we've experienced any kind of trauma. So we're going to start with some quotes from people with disabilities, that words that we have heard. And so we will get started with that now. So please just kind of be quiet and take these words in. I was raped from behind. Now every time someone walks behind me, I am scared.
All my life I have heard, no, don't, can't. Other people made all of my choices for me. When my uncle made me have sex with him, I didn't know I could say no.
When I told the staff what the driver did to me, they didn't believe me. They were mad. Maybe I should have stayed quiet. Later, he confessed what he did. He was found guilty in court. Then the staff got mad at me again. They said I was wrong for getting him in trouble.
My favorite staff person listened to me and waited for me to tell the whole story about my dad raping me. I could tell she cared. And then we talked about what I could do next. She believed me.
There are so many stories and so many quotes that we could share, but that gives you a sampling of the work that we do and the stories that we hear.
And in that last voice, when the survivor says, she believed me, I know many times we may feel ill-equipped to respond to a disclosure, or we don't know if we're going to say or do the right thing or make the situation worse. I hear those questions, what do I say, many times in my work with domestic and sexual violence. And really, that survivor told us what she needs us to do. It's that simple. Believe me. Be there with me. Be fully present. So what is trauma? I mean, when you think about the word trauma, what comes to mind? I'm going to invite you to take just a minute to write down what that word means to you.
And you can do that wherever you are on a piece of paper. You don't need to write it in the chat box, but just write it down.
One definition of trauma is that trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. and that it has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. That comes from SAMHSA.
And what is SAMHSA, Teresa?
It's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services
Administration.
What is that? Good acronyms, right? I got through most of it. But
so basically, something happens.
Yes.
The person perceives it as threatening or harmful, and there's lasting adverse effects. And those can be in a variety of different areas of the person's life. And it says or here, but it could be and, right?
Right. And you notice here, Shirley, there's not a list of it means these events.
Right.
Because you and I could experience the same event, and it impacts me deeply in a very negative way. And you're right next to me, and you didn't experience the same thing.
Exactly. So it's very individualized.
So sometimes what you may think of in the individuals you serve wouldn't be a traumatic event is extremely impactful to their lives. So we can't use our own frame of reference to define trauma for someone else.
Right. Absolutely. So let's look a little deeper at that. So basically, an event happens that overwhelms my ability to cope. You know, our brains are wired to help us cope with life. When something traumatic happens, from our perspective, our brain isn't able to figure it out. And some of the examples of that, of course, we always think about war and post-traumatic stress disorder and soldiers coming back home with that, but also adverse childhood experiences. A lot of studies on this now in terms of children who witness domestic violence, children who experience, you know, early childhood incest or sexual abuse, violence and disasters, accidents. And I spoke at a conference in Michigan recently at the ARC, and one of the self-advocates in the room said, a heart attack is traumatic, a heart attack. And I thought, wow, that's really insightful, because if I had a heart attack, it would impact me physically, of course, but also in my mind. I would be so scared that I've had another one. I'd be walking on eggshells trying to do things differently. So, you know, it can be things outside of what we might normally think about. But it really overloads that brain stress response, and it can actually develop an alarm response in us. And like Teresa said, every person reacts differently, but it can have really lasting effects on our bodies, on our health. The ACE studies of adverse childhood experiences found out that children who had more traumatic experiences at early ages were more likely to have lots of physical conditions as adults. And many of them actually died younger that had that. So we know that it impacts physical, but psychological, the way we view ourselves, the way we view other people, our relationships, and we oftentimes tend to forget about spirituality, but spiritual well-being can also be impacted. And you know what? It's really widespread. Many of us on this phone have experienced some kind of trauma. And when you look at the lives of people with disabilities, and we'll get into that, what happens there? What's happening with that?
And Shirley, you already mentioned that when this traumatic event or series of events occurs earlier in life, it's like it changes the direction of where we're going. It makes it much more difficult to cope. And it's not because there's something lacking in me. It's because the external is so powerful, it's so big, that I don't have the ability to cope with it. So even our own experiences coming into a situation may determine whether something impacts me and doesn't impact you.
Absolutely. And of course we know that in really young children where their brains are still developing, it can have a permanent impact. Not that it can't be overridden and changed in a new way, but that part of the brain will not be the same as if that trauma didn't happen. But because we're wonderful, resilient beings, they can develop new ways that are healthy. But there's damage. It changes the course.
Well, and if you've ever seen those diagrams of the brain where they show when trauma occurs at an early age, it's like it's rewired a new path. You know, how I experience, how I process thoughts, how I connect to stimuli is rerouted because of that trauma.
Absolutely.
That's pretty significant.
It is
significant. That it's not a behavioral change in and of itself. It is a biological change because the brain pattern is altered.
And the good news is people are very resilient, and we can recover even from severe trauma, but supports are necessary to make that healing possible. And trauma, the history of trauma can actually impact the identity of a person. The whole core of who that person was or could have been or was going to be can be changed.
But at the same time, that trauma can, with the supports, with the healing, can lead to something very beautiful. So it's not a negative thing, and I would just be so bold as to say folks that are listening to this webinar are about that change, are about those supports, and you will truly make a difference because of the work that you do.
You bet. And then to go a little bit deeper into this, we're going to talk about big T trauma and little t trauma. So we all know about big T trauma, war, being in a hurricane where people die, the really big events, sexual assault. But little traumas can also have a similar effect. The accumulation of smaller traumas can be as damaging as bigger traumas. And this is some new information. Karen Harvey writes a lot about this, and she's at the ARC in Massachusetts. But it makes so much sense to me as someone who's been counseling people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for years around trauma issues. And one of the clues that can help us identify if a response someone has, they may have a trauma history, is if they're responding to something much more intense than we believe that situation warrants. And the example I frequently use is I went to pick a woman up once at a group home, and we were going to go out to dinner and do some shopping, and I can't remember exactly, but I got there, and she was so happy to see me, and she was really excited to go, and she said, let me go get my purse, and in about 30 seconds, I heard this yelling, screaming, throwing things. She couldn't find her purse, and that didn't really warrant that kind of trauma or that kind of response, and I pretty much knew then this woman has a trauma history. And we were able to talk about it. She was able to say that feeling of powerlessness reminded me of when XYZ happened to me so many times, so many years ago, and had never really had anyone to help her through that and work through that and find new ways to deal with that. So.
And I love what you said there, because you said, I assumed that there was a reason behind this. Instead of trying to respond with she did something wrong, this is inappropriate, or, come on, as even, I've heard in my own life where someone said, well, that's not a big deal, suck it up, go on, and instead recognizing maybe this one thing here that I'm seeing is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And so let me respond by asking myself, I wonder what's happened to this individual that the purse situation creates such a huge response to it. To me, that's sometimes why little traumas have so much more impact, because of the response they receive or the lack of support from other folks. And so I feel almost bad about having a traumatic reaction.
Yes, I totally get that. So remember that these little T's can add up. And when you think about the people that you work with and support, so these are some of the little T's that seem really big to folks, okay? A lifetime of people trying to fix you. People tell me all the time, I'm broken, I need fixed, all the time. The doctors are fixing me, the therapists are fixing me, my family's fixing me, the school's fixing me. People are just trying to teach me how to do the things I can't do. It's all about being fixed in that medical model in the history that still continues so much today. And how does that make you feel?
Well, I think of so many people in this field, myself included, that are problem solvers. If someone comes to me with, something that is wrong, I want to jump in and fix it. I want to jump in and do it for them. And I really had a struggle with training myself not to do that. Right. Because even though I may be trying to, quote, fix a problem, not the person, it translates into, I don't believe you can do it yourself.
Right. Exactly. So that trauma of being called names, the R word, oh my gosh. I worked with a man one time who had horrible physical and sexual abuse and neglect, had been abandoned several times and left on, just awful stuff. And he could talk about all those things, but when we talked about the R word and being called names and being made fun of, he said that was the worst. That was worse than anything he endured, because it got to the core of him as a person. And everybody heard it and everybody saw it. It was more visible. And that was the worst trauma for him. So again, it's that personal experience, the trauma of invalidation, being left out, not being validated as a person who has resources and gifts and talents and contributions to make. And how many times has that happened to folks that we serve and support? Many times a day, often.
Well, and from an early age on, whether it's the birthday parties, the sleepovers, all those things that, most kids look forward to being a part of. It's kind of like the being picked last for the team every single time, every day of your life. Sure. And that's invalidation as to, my special qualities.
Exactly. And the last one we listed here was the trauma from extended hospitalizations. And for many people, when they've had to have a lot of hospitalizations as young children, to have multiple surgeries to fix things, there can be abandonment issues, there can be attachment issues. You lack trust in the environment and what's going to happen next. And that can be very traumatic and oftentimes extend, through adulthood, those extended hospitalizations. So, and again, it's the person's experience, and you miss out on stuff, right? And all of these things can result in what we call complex trauma. So experiencing one trauma one time is horrible, for a person, and it can be traumatic, of course. But think about someone who experiences all of these kinds of little T's, plus has, high risk and a lot of experiences of sexual assault, domestic violence, and other kinds of trauma. So it gets much more complicated to treat and to support people, but we certainly can do that.
And so we mentioned before about that intersection, that when trauma occurs, it really is a pivotal point. It can change the path that we're on, although, again, that can be redirected through supports. But as you said, Shirley, it really can get at the essence or the core of what I believe about myself, how I perceive myself. And this goes beyond just domestic and sexual violence. We're talking any type of trauma because of that feeling of helplessness, because of that lack of trust and connectedness with others. It's going to change me, basically. It's going to change how I relate to others, Unfortunately, many times trauma, and certainly trauma that digs deepest, is a result of people that we care about, or people that should care about us. And so there is nothing worse than being violated by someone who's supposed to love you, someone who's supposed to take care of you, someone who is, who you depend on, all of those things. So, if I can't trust the person in my life who's supposed to be there for me, how in the world am I going to trust and connect with anybody else?
Absolutely.
So we can, when you talk, Shirley, about the physical piece of it, even if the trauma is not a physical health issue, it can become a physical health issue because of how I'm responding. After trauma, there may be dramatic changes in my diet, in my sleep patterns, in my, just my internal organs, all the stress-related illnesses that come out. And I'm even talking about very young ones where that occurs. It's not just with adults. In fact, many times, because the less a person has the ability to express, to articulate how they're feeling, the more their body has to express it for them. And so that's the churning in the stomach, that's the physical, activity, that's all those things just helping me cope with really what feels like a mountain.
And so from that, we can extrapolate or connect to what Teresa just said, the value of teaching people to identify and express their feelings. I know from many years of working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we don't do that real well very often. And so that can change so many things in somebody's life to be able to express. I mean, joy and happiness as well as fear, as well as anger, as well as frustration. And, starting with very simple ways and getting more complicated. So that's a wonderful thing for you to be able to help people do, because if it stays inside, for all of us, it's going to do something inside of our bodies that probably isn't very healthy. So,
well, and it's so easy to reward the person who is happy, who is, just easy, gets along with everybody, never rocks the boat, all those types of things that maybe as a staff person it makes it easier for me. But in essence, that's invalidating any other feeling I might have, If when I am angry, you don't want to be around me, or it's a, now don't do that, Teresa, then I'll quickly learn not to do that. As if those other feelings are bad.
Absolutely. I was working with a woman one time at an agency, and somebody came in and interrupted, and they said, you're that consultant, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I got a question for you, because you're probably really smart. And I'm like, well, I think we're all smart. But anyway, this is what she said. I want to know why staff can have a bad day, but I can't have a bad day. I get punished if I have a bad day. Don't we all have moments? And I thought that was brilliant, because, yes, we all have moments. We all have a difficult time expressing negative emotion, but that's something we can all learn to do better and live healthier lives because of it. But also we can help people that we support learn how to, first of how we can view them as having a moment rather than a bad person because they have this behavior as we define it, but also think about ourselves and look at the whole big picture. You know, how can we help folks deal with it when they have those moments in a more supportive way?
Oh, goodness, I would have quite a behavior plan on all my moments.
So would I. Did you talk to Mr. Pat?
Oh, you know, actually have talked about that quite a bit, and I guess right here the only part I want to emphasize before we move forward is the support, the services, what you and I do, and those of you participating in this webinar, that is key to the future path.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, the sooner we can come and wrap around that support after the trauma, the better.
Mm-hmm.
But even if it was a long time ago, if you're still seeing things that indicate trauma was there, it's not too late to give that support and redirect the path. We are very, you know, sometimes I think we're like Play-Doh. You know, we can be, you know, we can be pliable and change, and even when we get a little crusty because the lid's been left off for a while, you can still bring that back to life, you know, and
yes.
And some of us are a little more crusty than others, Shirley.
Absolutely. You never know. You know, I had a staff come up to me one day, and she said, "Are you sure that you're an incest survivor? Because you seem really, really happy." So I think people have this vision. I won't tell you what went through my mind. I was like, really? But I think many of us have a vision that when somebody's been a victim, quote-unquote victim, that's their life. But no, we can be survivors, we can be thrivers, we can have really wonderful, meaningful lives and do well, but we need support and we need a path to get there.
You know, in my world with domestic and sexual violence, a lot of folks prefer to be called survivors because they don't want to feel like, you know, they're stuck in that, you know, helpless spot where I've been victimized. I have, yes, that happened, to acknowledge and to honor that, but to also recognize who I am today.
Absolutely. We all need that. So trauma responses. So when someone is experiencing trauma, usually one of three things happen: fight, flight, or freeze. So the fight, of course, you know, you're literally fighting, you're responding, you're trying to stop it, you're trying to protect yourself, you're actively involved in fighting this situation. Another possible response is flight. You run away. You run away, you run away, you get out of there. And the other one is freezing. You know, you almost become immobilized where you can't move. And a lot of people have talked with me about how they shut down so they didn't have to experience it so deeply. They, you know, kind of went into their own mind. They might have stared at the lamp or the ceiling or whatever in the room, and they really didn't experience it as much as if they were fully present. So they go off into this other place. And many times when we see people years later who have this trauma history, this is what happens when they get scared again or when they feel helpless again. They may fight, they may run, they may freeze. And some people have a combination of those. If you know you can't fight this person, it may be the time to run, or it may be the time to freeze. Some people tend to maybe always do one. So when we talk about people, well, he's an eloper, which is a label I wouldn't suggest that we use on people, but I hear it frequently. There's something they're running from. Let's find out what it is, and let's find a new way to help them learn how to deal with that, or let's find a way to avoid that fearful situation.
Well, and in the meantime, let's find a way to help them have choices around that. So if I need to flee, you know, I know there's times if I'm having that stressful day at the office, you know, even if I've got a looming deadline, sometimes I just need to say, I need to take a 10-minute walk. I need to be, you know what, and I can do that. I have the choice to do that. But sometimes individuals that we serve don't have that freedom to leave where they're at to go walk someplace else. So how do we help someone who is experiencing the need to get out of the moment, to get out of that situation? And so it's not just acknowledging this is how they feel, but looking at our service system to say, how do we give space for these three response types? So can you think of ways that folks could change maybe how services are delivered to give that freedom there?
Well, I think we're going to talk individually about how to do service planning around these things, but I think it's really important as agencies that we look at that. Now, freeze doesn't tend to get the consequences that fighting and eloping do, but freezing, sometimes it may look like inattention or inability to stay on task. So just if we know somebody and we know that they're freezing because they're having a memory of when they were assaulted, for example, one of the things we can do is help ground them. And we're going to give you some tools that can be used to help people to ground. And when I say grounding, it means bringing them back to the present. Because if in your mind you're going to the memory of a trauma that happened to you and you're freezing because of that, and it's the people around you think you're just, you know, lazy and you're off task, we're going to talk about some ways that you can work with people so that you can bring them back to the present moment. And that's healthy for them and healthy for us. So we can talk about that. For flighting, you can give them other alternatives. Is there a place you can we turn on some music so you can dance or get that pressure out? You know, is there a place in the building or on the grounds where you can take a walk? You know, is there a piece of equipment? I can't think of the word of those walking machines, but that in the basement. A treadmill that you can go use. So, you know, y'all are very creative about these things, but these are the areas where you want to think about it.
So, again, acknowledging those three different reactions, I think it's important to not try to take them away from someone, but to understand why they have them. I mean, when we learn to respond, whether, you know, it's flight, freeze, fight, we do that because it's a survival skill. Mm-hmm. And to take that away would be even more threatening. So understanding, even if it's something that seems self-destructive, you know, to know the person is doing this because it helps them cope. So if they found it worked, even if for the moment, meaning they made it through that situation, they're going to be likely to repeat it again, especially when the same type of trauma or the response, the same feeling of helplessness occurs again. They're going to try that. They're going to go back to what worked before. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you might have someone who's had a lot of experience with coping with their trauma. And so, again, we caution you not to try to yank that away, even if it causes problems later in life. You know, we need to substitute it. What else? How can I work with you to find another way to cope with those feelings? Or how can I eliminate some of the triggers or some of the reminders? Mm-hmm. And then most of all, as you said, you know, it's reframing the way I'm looking at it.
Exactly. And typically we might say, well, they're having a behavior, and this is what people with da-da-da-da diagnosis do. Or this is part of their diagnosis. They're just having a behavior, and we're going to put them on a behavior plan, and we're going to take things away, and we're going to make them work for things. And really, we'll talk much more about shifting our view of behavior, but that's not helpful. That is not a helpful response. So what are the effects of trauma long-term? There's a lack, short-term and long-term. The effects are lack of sense of safety, and you're living your life where you don't feel safe all the time, and maybe you never feel safe. It just depends on the person. You're very disconnected from other people, so there's this lack of trust, lack of feeling safe around people. And powerlessness is huge, because when trauma happens, the person has no power over that event, and they don't know what to do. So there's that powerlessness, and there's nothing I can do to change this, and how frustrating is that to live? So the main three effects of all the trauma research says lack of sense of safety, disconnected from self and other people, and that whole sense of no power. I have no power at all.
Now, this picture on the slide is one image, but I also want to challenge you to look for the person who may be the center of attention, loves to, you know, to maybe in a room full of folks, not necessarily isolated or withdrawn, and still be experiencing that lack of trust or disconnection and all of that. So we have to be careful not to say, you know, this means the person who isn't engaging with other people, because I can experience these three things and be in the mix of it.
Or you can engage with people all the time, but never trust them, and never share anything deep or feeling-wise. I mean, we all know people like that are very aloof, but, you know, maybe the class clown, and maybe, you know, people that can be around folks a lot.
Right. Or you're just waiting for that bad thing to happen. It's like the inevitable. This is what life's like. So, you know, I'll interact with you, but I know sooner or later you're going to hurt me.
Right. And many times what we might see is that person pushing other people away before they can push them away. So someone who rejects other folks on a regular basis when they were just starting to get maybe closer, because they know deep down that person can never like them and they can't trust them.
So again, with these, you know, what you're describing, I'm thinking of anyone with or without a disability. And so the challenge here is, if I have a disability and I'm in a structured service system, how do I get to do those things? You know, if I can't push people away, because these are the folks that provide my service. This is the workshop that I attend. This is the, you know, the school or the classes that I'm involved in. So where are my choices, so that way I can keep myself feeling okay? More challenging.
Absolutely. So we want to talk a minute about triggers or reminders. And a trigger is really something that happens. It can be internal or external, that triggers a memory of a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. This can be a color, a smell, a picture, a person, a set of keys, a paperclip. It can be just, the list is unlimited. And it may result in a trauma response. So you may see a person who has one of the 3 F's, you know, fight, flight, or freeze, in their personal rendition of that. It can actually result in the person re-experiencing the event. I worked with a person who, in the middle of the night, would get up and crawl down the hall, stripping her clothes off and screaming. And we found out through some evaluation and work with her that she was re-experiencing being raped in bed and trying to get down the hall and get away from the person who was stripping her clothes off, and she really felt that was happening again. She was reliving these, and it came through nightmares, an internal event. The person may not recognize what's going on. The others in the environment may not recognize what's going on. But a trigger is really important, because one of the things that we do as we start working with individuals is try to help them identify those triggers and help us identify those triggers. Sometimes we can work with people in environments to avoid the triggers, and we can also help people change their response to those triggers.
That is so empowering. You know, when I work with victims and they talk about, you know, I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm losing it because all of a sudden, out of the blue, my heart starts racing and I have trouble breathing and I just want to get away. I want to run, and they don't understand why. And so when they're armed with the knowledge, this is normal, you know, because when that first statement says it triggers a memory, it may be a body memory, not a cognitive memory of, oh yeah, this takes me back to this one incident or these several incidents. It may not take you anywhere other than to the physical reaction that is pretty scary. So the more we can teach people with disabilities about triggers and then get to how to cope with those and understand that there's nothing wrong with them. This is a normal response. The more we support their healing.
Absolutely. And remember, we did what we had to do in order to survive. We mentioned this a little bit, but coping skills that we developed may no longer serve us. And this is a quote I saw somewhere: it's better to have bad breath than no breath at all. It's better to, you know, have these coping skills that aren't serving us anymore than to feel like we're not alive at all. So here's a question. Think about a person that you work with who may have what is labeled as a behavior problem. Can you imagine that person without the problem behavior? Can you see them coping well with life? Can you see them interacting with others pleasantly? Can you see them without the behavior? If we cannot see a person without the problem behavior, how are we going to help them move to a new place? How are we going to help them find a new way to be in relation to emotions and trauma history? And the core question of trauma-informed services is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you? What happened to you? And when we switch those questions to folks and in our own minds as we view them, everything changes. It shifts because we're not looking at the person as a behavior and a bad person. When I ask people what the word inappropriate means, self-advocates, they say it means I'm bad. It means I'm bad. And so none of us want to be labeled as bad. We might have behaviors that appear that way. But what happened to you is a different kind of question, because when we figure that out, we can change how we're supporting the person.
And I would add one more to that. In addition to what's wrong with you, instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's strong in you.
What's strong in you? I love that.
You know, so that way we believe that they have the strength, they have the skills, they have what it takes to move forward.
I love that.
Prevalence, well, you know, there's a lot of research out there, and we didn't want to spend too much time on that because, you know, it's overwhelming. You know, I worked in the disability field really early on in my social services career while I was in college, and I had no clue of the prevalence. I went in and out of rooms, assisting people with personal hygiene, dressing, all of those things, and the thought never ever crossed my mind that the environment put so many individuals at risk. There were times, you know, it was a handful of staff, and I might be off in one wing by myself, you know, interacting with folks with no supervision, no cameras, no anything. And, you know, I could have made all sorts of choices to harm folks. But it never dawned on me that that was the case. But when you look at this prevalence data, it's just outstanding in a very, very sad way. So we know that people with disabilities experience sexual assault, specifically sexual assault, more than other individuals without disabilities, but also other crimes, more than twice the rate. You know, and so looking at what causes that, is it the disability itself or the environment? And the environment piece we can really work on.
Right.
As I mentioned, there were lots of studies out there. I'm going to turn you to another one that says as many as 90% of the people, now this is specifically with cognitive or developmental disabilities, will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. So if you are right now at a center, a disability service agency, think in your head how many folks you serve today, your agency as a whole. So if you have 100 people who are walking through the door of your agency and you serve individuals with developmental or cognitive disabilities, 90 of them that came through your door this morning have experienced sexual assault.
According to this study. Yes. And that's overwhelming. You know, I think once we realize that nearly everybody we serve has experienced some kind of trauma, it really changes how we do the work that we do. We have to recognize it without a shadow of a doubt. We have to do things differently. We have to look at trauma-informed responses in organizations and services so that we're helping folks that have these histories.
Well, and also when we talk about the crime, I think sometimes it's important to realize this is sexual contact, sexual activity without consent. So, you know, whether it be lightly touching someone in private areas, whether it be asking them to look at, you know, pornographic materials, I mean, all of those things without consent, that produces trauma.
And recognizing that staff members cannot get consent from people that they serve because of the authoritative nature of the relationship. And also, it's not on the slide, but around 96% of people with disabilities who experience sexual assault, 96% of the time it's somebody they know and trust, or the family knows and trusts, or the service providers know and trust. So when we talk about stranger danger, that's okay to work on stranger danger, but 96% of the time, that's not who's doing the harm. So we have to really open our minds to the possibilities that somebody that we work with or a family member may be doing this harm. And there's many, many, many things that we can do to reduce the risk and to respond to the person if and when it does happen. So Motive says, we need to presume that the clients we serve have a history of traumatic stress and exercise universal precautions. Now, we all think of universal precautions as, I need to wash my hands because I don't know who may have this germ or this disease. But it's the same kind of thing. We're going to put some practices into place that we're going to do with everybody that makes it, because there's a possibility. We may never know for sure about the traumatic stress or event that's in that person's life. So we're going to create a culture that's trauma-informed so that everybody, including the workforce, is feeling okay as much as possible. So let's think about how we're going to find out if folks have a traumatic history. Now, most of the assessment forms I've looked at across the nation rarely ask people if they have a trauma history. That's not really true for people who have a lived experience of mental illness. A lot of those are doing that because they recognize the high prevalence. But many of the intellectual and developmental disability service organizations really aren't asking folks. So how are we going to do that? So I would ask you to think about what areas of assessment might lend itself to discussing trauma in both intake and then at our annual or however frequent you're doing your service planning. Can it fit in with health questions, safety, supports, and really look at your assessment tools and processes to think about where would be a good place to do that. I'd encourage you to have self-advocates involved in that process, people that you serve helping think about where would it be. The other thing to know is that what indicators may be present. Let me back up a minute. Whoever's asking these questions, they really need to be trained in trauma and how to respond to disclosures, because frequently once we start asking people, we're going to get lots of disclosures and lots of information. But also, if people aren't able to tell in a way that's easy for us to understand, we need to be able to understand what the indicators are that might be present that indicate this person is currently being abused or may have some past trauma. And we don't have time to go through those today. Anybody that emails me, I will send you those. Our contact information is on the last slide, so we will show that to you. But learning what those indicators are, so when you can see them, you may say, you know, you've been acting differently. This is different. What, you know, what's going on? And for people that might not be able to tell you easily, there's other ways that we can work through that. So those are a couple areas to think about.
And when you were suggesting, Shirley, that on the assessment, those questions are asked to promote the conversation,
yes.
You know, to me that means that's for everybody.
Right.
You know, so it becomes very normal that we ask these questions. I'm not just looking at some going, they look like they might have a history of trauma, so I'll ask this section. It becomes standardized. And sometimes when you present it that way, I ask these questions of everyone. It makes people feel like they're not being singled out or targeted, or what, how can you suspect this is an issue, or how did someone tell you, or what have you. So if we just normalize it as, you know, part of our conversation, it makes it easier for the person to disclose.
And I may decide not to disclose today, but I know this is a safe place to do it because people are having those conversations. And I get to choose when and if and who I talk to it about.
And it must be that it's happened to someone besides me because you're asking everybody about it. So I'm not the only one that's experienced that. That's another benefit, even if I choose not to disclose with you.
Thank you.
So when someone shares this really sacred space with you, they disclose something that is so painful, so personal. You know, we mentioned earlier that one of the things that trauma impacts is trust and connection with others. So it's so important that we recognize that they trust us, that they have given us this information, and they may not even want us to do anything about it. They just want to be able to tell. And so you really need to take the lead from the person who's disclosing, you know, before you rush out. I mean, one of the things that we've dealt with here in Illinois has been disability service staff that are so knowledgeable and respectful of mandatory reporting rules. And so, you know, as soon as there's a disclosure, there's that tendency to want to jump to, okay, you shared, now I need to go do this. And trusting and looking to the other person to say, how would you like me to respond to this, you know, or what can we do together? Now, that doesn't negate following through on mandatory reporting, but again, this person has trusted you. You need to honor that space and go, Shirley, I'm sorry this happened to you. What can we do right now? And then, of course, best scenario is I shared with you in the past that I am a mandatory reporter, so you know when you're sharing with me that you know, some action is going to need to be taken. You know, probably the worst thing that in terms of invalidation is just to ignore it. It's kind of like, you know, you dump something, well, thanks for sharing, you know, and on to the next question on the assessment.
And another thing I want to mention about just ignore it, many times people will come to us and say, you know, Bobby called me a name today, and we say, just ignore it. Or this, you know, it's kind of the smaller little cheese. When those happen, we frequently say just ignore it. So people actually get the message that if someone hurts me, I'm supposed to ignore it. So I think we have to be really careful about the messages we're giving people when they have problems. And whether we think it shouldn't be a big problem or not, because we don't want to teach people to ignore things, especially when people are hurting them. So I wanted to bring that up as well.
And I know, Shirley, you're saying when it's the smaller examples, but I also know, unfortunately, sometimes when it's the big traumas, it's ignored as well. Because, you know, Shirley, you have disclosed this 30 times, and each time we had it investigated and it wasn't true. So next time when you say it, I'm just ignoring it.
Yeah. And, you know, one place I consulted with, they had a person who was disclosing on a regular basis. And they were actually taking her to the hospital for forensic exams. And as we figured out, she was actually reliving a rape that had happened previously over and over. And so she was actually, in many ways, getting re-victimized because nobody really understood what was going on with her. But Other people that have that happen are said, well, we don't believe you because you've said this too many times. So we've really got to look at the big picture when we're working with folks and really dig in and find out their real story. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And understand that they're most likely to tell you when nobody else is present. So for some positions, if you're never alone with people because you do home visits all the time and there's always a family member around, for example, you got to find a new way to introduce that to families, that you really need to have some quiet time with the person so that if something is going on, they can tell you if they choose to.
Mm-hmm. And that's a real challenge to do that, especially when you have a good relationship with a family member, when they're very, they seem very supportive of the individual that receives your services. To tell them to leave the room or to ask them to, it seems like, oh, what? How come you don't trust me to have this conversation? But if we start from the very beginning of the relationship where that's a part of it, and even to approach it where this is very empowering for the individual, so that you and I can work together and it's no, disrespect to the family member. Exactly. But it's a hard practice to get into, especially when you're changing relationship after you've been working with someone for a while.
And remember that recanting doesn't mean it didn't happen. And recanting means the person at some point says, never mind, it didn't happen. And they would go, oh, they lied all the time. It didn't happen. But that's not what happens. What happens many, many times is the person is feeling so overwhelmed with the negative response, people blaming the person, people not believing the person, people, not involving the person in the solutions, all that, your whole life's falling apart. So never mind, forget it. I wish I wouldn't have said anything. Recanting doesn't mean it didn't happen. We have to really, really remember that, because when you get down to the statistics, false reports are very, very rare. And when there's a trauma-informed approach, they're down to less than 1%. So.
Right. Well, let's face it, and surely haven't you? I know I have been in a staff meeting where I brought up an issue, and it became such a stir. Like, just forget it. It's not a big deal. I'm sorry I brought it up. No, I don't want to have that committee work on that. So we recant, and it doesn't mean that it's because it wasn't true. It's because it became just too big of a deal and not worth it.
Absolutely. And just always remember that we need to start by believing. There's actually a whole website and Facebook page on this. You can sign a pledge. You can learn more. You can hear people's stories. You can actually have a campaign in your community. There's the website, because we both believe very deeply in this. So responding to disclosures. Teresa, tell us how this works.
Well, some of these are a little more difficult in terms of providing privacy. You might need to think through ahead of time. In the organization you serve, the physical space, when you interact with individuals with disabilities, is there a place that if someone said, I need to tell you something really important, can you pull them to that quiet, safe space where they can privately share with you? That's really important to have that. To explain options and versus advise them. That's real different. Going back to that, do I need to fix this? No, I need to share with you, here's some choices. Maybe walk through, what do you think might be the benefits of this option? What might be the benefits of that option, to help them choose, but not to do for. And trust me, especially with ongoing abusive relationships, it's a struggle for people who work in that field every day not to advise someone, you just need to leave him and go on to a different relationship. Right. People want to do that because they want to stop the hurting. That's not our job to do that. We really need to provide the option and then support that choice. If you say, I choose to stay in this relationship, then I say, let's talk about keeping you safe. What are some things that you can do to stay safe? And it might be developing a safety plan, but it's supporting your choice.
Right. And there are exceptions to that in the world of people with disabilities, Teresa. Just say,
I know.
It's a staff member, they don't get to choose that.
Exactly.
So, and there's other situations too. But as much as possible, always supporting the person's choice. So.
But we also know people with disabilities have intimate relationships as well.
Absolutely.
Good personal relationships that sometimes become unhealthy.
Sure.
So as you said, the do's are to believe, to be respectful, just to support the person, and and that may look different for each person. It doesn't necessarily mean support is, I want you to go call an advocate at a rape crisis center or at a domestic violence program. Maybe the support for me is someone else that I work with, or a pastor or whatever. But so ask me. I'm really the expert on what's best. So you can assist me. You can support me however I ask for. So That's a lot of it. So it's real simple things. You know, we certainly don't mean to be offensive, but it happens so much that, you know, that we can doubt what's said because it just doesn't sound plausible, or someone doesn't have the facts in order. Shirley and I do a lot of training of law enforcement, and many times they want this chronological, you know, account of what happened, but how the person experienced it isn't chronological. It's many times by those body memories. You know, this is what it felt like, this is what I was experiencing, and I wasn't looking at a clock to see exactly this happened at this time, etc. So people tend to respond as if they doubt, you know, was it really green or blue shirt he was wearing? Was it, you know, as if you're questioning me. And unfortunately, even the judgment, you know, I can't tell you how many times victims have blamed themselves because someone said, well, you shouldn't be wearing a skirt that tight. Or what were you thinking being grocery shopping in the middle of the night? Or what, and those types of questions means it's my fault.
And Teresa, even the question, why didn't you tell me sooner?
Oh, yeah.
Is blaming. I mean, the person perceives that as blaming. Oh, I should have done this differently. So it's complicated, but it's also very simple. Let the person tell the story. Listen, be present. And these are some things that you can say. You can say, I believe you. I'm sorry this happened to you. You're not alone. Thank you for trusting me with this.
Yeah.
I
love
ask
that.
questions, right?
Because it's just simple words, plain talk, nothing big, you know. It's certainly letting the person know, and if you don't know, I encourage you to find out what are the resources in your community, who is the DV agency, what number do I call for the Rape Crisis Center, and then ask the person if they would like you to assist in calling. You know, maybe that's when they come to your agency is when they have access to a telephone, so giving them that linkage so they can make that connection.
Absolutely. And finding out what would make you feel safe right now.
Right.
What can I do to help you feel safer right now?
And that might be right after the disclosure, but come back to that later as well,
Absolutely.
you know, because some of the things that I need to feel safe right now may be very different, you know, a month from now. And we don't forget about safety just because the police report has been filed or the action has been taken and even maybe the perpetrator has been removed. That doesn't mean I feel safe.
Sure. So Teresa mentioned a few things about mandatory reporting, but these are the best practices as it relates to mandatory reporting, especially with folks who have experienced trauma. Tell the person you're mandated reporter as often as you can. If you're running a group, tell the group. If you're working with somebody individually, tell them. When there is a disclosure, and you have to call the Inspector General's office, Adult Protective Services, offer them an opportunity to report with you. Offer them an advocate, preferably from an external entity like Domestic Violence Services or Rape Crisis Center. Keep the person informed. People tell me all the time, I never know what's going on. Nobody tells me what's going on. And you may feel that way too when it comes to external mandatory reporting. But as much as you know, keep the person informed. Engage them in finding out with you. Engage the person in the follow-up. So those are some quick things to keep in mind as you think about mandatory reporting.
You say quick things, but that's really a staff training. I mean,
it is. We could do a whole training on that, but those are some.
But it's a new way of viewing. Go beyond the mandatory and look at the person.
And the really exciting thing, if you think about, there's individual level of change, there's organizational change, but there's also systems change. So working with, if any of you are in that position, working with the state entities that do the abuse investigations of adults with disabilities to think about the messages they're giving to the field, to the disability service providers. If this happens, you got 3 hours to call this number, why aren't we giving some messages about how to support people? You know, so that when someone tells you, you know what to say, instead of, I got to go make a call. So, you know, there's different levels of systems change that we can talk about in relation to creating trauma-informed systems.
And one of those, not changes, but one of those responses might be, you just disclosed with me, and I'm really anxious. And so if you can be present with me and help bring me back, and that's grounding activities.
Yeah, that's grounding activities. So we're going to talk a little bit about some grounding activities. And again, this is a way to help the person calm down, come back to the present. The first is something that Stephanie Covington created, and it's called 5 senses. And so you can, if a person appears to be or is in her mind, his or her mind, and they're somewhere else and they're reliving something, you can remind them about the 5 senses. Now, I always work with people ahead of time on this and individual counseling and stuff, but you could do it if you don't have to be a counselor to do it. So the 5 things are 5 things I see. So if I ask all of you right now, look around wherever you are and identify 5 things that you see, you should probably find 5 things pretty quickly. And you'd ask the person, say them out loud or write them, whatever works for that person. Then you would go to 5 things that you can touch. 4 things. So you're going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things that you hear, 2 things that you smell, and 1 thing that you taste. So by the time you walk a person through these things, they're in the present, because you have to look in the present, you have to touch in the present, hear in the present, smell in the present, and taste in the present. So that usually is all that's needed to help a person do that. Like I said, you need to practice it with them ahead of time so that when you remind, okay, 5 senses, or tell me what you see, 5 things, and if they don't know how to count to 5, you can work through that. One more, one more, one more. So that's one grounding activity that's very helpful with many people. Another one is general breathing, because we all know if you breathe right, it really does help you calm down and come to the present. So I'm going to walk you through that, even though I can't see if you're doing this or not. But if you put your hand on your stomach, the lower part, about around your navel, maybe a little bit below, and you're going to breathe in through your nose. And as you breathe, your hand will come out. It will expand. And you're going to breathe out through your mouth. When you inhale, your stomach comes out. When you exhale, your stomach goes back in. So we're going to do that real quick. Well, maybe not real quick. We're going to do that. Okay, so breathe in and breathe out. Again, we're going to inhale and exhale. So again, I would work with people individually. I've even done it in small groups of self-advocates where we practice breathing. And so that when it's time and somebody's having a difficult moment, I might walk up to them and put my hand on my stomach and not have to say anything because they'll know, oh, I'm supposed to breathe. Or I may walk up and take a big inhale through my nose. And they'll know, oh, I'm supposed to breathe. Let me try breathing. Maybe that'll work. Not that I'm supposed to, but that's an idea that surely that might help me. So breathing with people, and I usually do it with the person, so we can both be calm.
You could even use relaxation techniques.
Sure, relaxation
imagery, that type of thing. If you have trouble doing the breathing yourself, that's
absolutely. There are so many things you can do. I'm going to show you a heart chart in a minute. WRAP stands for Wellness Recovery Action Planning, and that's something you can Google and learn more about that. But I met one woman I knew had a mood board, and so she had this big piece of big construction paper or poster board, and she had 4 different quadrants, 4 different sections. So one section was happy pictures, and she cut them out of magazines, and one was when she's really angry, and then there was the sad one. I can't remember what the 4th one was right now, but so she would actually go to her mood board, and sometimes people would say, Sue, do you need to go check your mood board? And she, if she was really angry, she might look at that, but then she also may adjust her vision up to the happy part or the soothing part. So that was something that worked for her. I also have a picture on here of a bracelet that's woven, or I don't know crafty words, but anyway, the bracelet on this picture. I worked with one person who had something similar, and she would go to each one, and she had positive statements that she used. So she would hold on to one, and she said, I'm okay. She'd take a big breath, and she'd go to the next one. She said, I really am okay, or whatever, her statements were. This is temporary. She had her statements, and by the time she got to the other side, she was usually in pretty good shape. So now we'll go to the heart chart. I've used this with probably hundreds of people, and so a lot of folks that I work with understand, even though they may have intellectual disabilities, that when you've been hurt by somebody or something, you have a broken heart. They really do get that there's a whole heart and a broken heart. And so we have this chart, and we come up with things that help, and we come up with things that hurt. And we may have pictures on here, we may have words on here, but it's really about the person becoming more aware of, if they're having a hard time, what helps and what makes it worse. And so a lot of times we will work on this maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then they'll choose if they want to share it with their staff. Some of them want to put it in their charts, or some of them want to hang it on, some room, office in the group home. Different people do different things with it. And some of them just want to keep it for themselves. But it's really been helpful to folks to really focus in on what helps and what hurts, so that they can, when they are hurting, they can go, oh, I forgot, this music helps me. You know, I'm going to do this music. Drawing helps me. Taking a walk helps me. Sitting with my favorite staff member helps me. Making a phone call to mom helps me. Whatever that might be. All of those same things could be hurtful for someone else. So that's another tool that we're sharing with you today. But when you think about healing and recovery, it's really like this picture. This is how we want grief to work. This is how we want healing to work. We want to know, I'm going to start with this at this point. There's a straight line over here to this point, and I'm done. But that's not how grief works. Any of you that have lost someone you loved in your life, you know that's not how grief works. You know, it's really difficult. It's really much more like this other picture, which is just a big old scrambled mess, right? But every time you go through one of those tangles, you're a little further along. It's not a straight path. You make 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it's real important that those of us who are supporting a healing and recovery journey that we recognize this, because we may put some really cool things in place with the person, for the person, and we're thinking it's not working because that's how grief works. And it may be working really well, because sometimes you have to go in deeper and deeper, and you can only do that 1 layer at a time because it's too painful to do it all at once. So it may be working beautifully, and only the person knows that, and it may not feel like it all the time. But just keep that in mind when you're supporting somebody in this process.
Well, and I think how empowering that is for an individual to know that, you know, because I think most of us think that if we're getting better, it's a straight curve up, right? And so I think if something's wrong with me, I'm not healing, I'm not doing this right, but just to share that with survivors, that this is what healing is like, this is what grief work is like, this is what, so it's not just for us to know as staff, it's also to pass that knowledge along to the person who's experienced trauma.
You bet.
And with that healing, it's also helpful for us to recognize that those 3 areas that were impacted by trauma are the 3 core elements to healing. So where there's been a sense of safety taken away, we need to work towards, you know, to creating that safe place, that feeling of I'm okay, I'm safe. We also need to do that in terms of connection and empowerment. And we've talked about empowerment several times in terms of the more we can do in terms of giving information, choices, options, opportunities, that helps heal. So think about that, you know, if you're working with someone who's experienced trauma, what things can you do to help boost up each of these areas? Okay? You know, it's really like if there's a physical wound, you know, if I've been amazed. I had a family member recently go through surgery, and when I was visiting the hospital, and there was this big old gaping wound, and I thought, oh my goodness, you need to heal, you need to sew that up. And they're like, you know, I mean, did they just do surgery and leave it wide open? Are there some stitches or something that should happen here? And it was the stitching on the inside, because then it would heal without infection, and with time, the exit wound or the external would heal up. It would close. And I think trauma is a lot like that. We get so focused on the outside isn't looking right, you know, the behavior, you know, they're not happy enough, they're not moving on, etc. But realize trauma is very deep, and we have to do that inside healing before we're going to see it on the outside. You know, so there is that parallel process. It also speaks to the fact that it's so easy to re-traumatize. You know, if you've had an injury, you know, it's likely, or it's more likely that you're going to re-injure that, because once you've done the damage, it's more susceptible. And so, what about that when it comes to trauma? I think that's true as well.
You bet. So some other things to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we're expanding our reach to all folks. So a couple areas to think about. People with disabilities who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Many times there's additional traumas there because staff members, family members, you know, part of this extended family, if you will, are not accepting people. They're trying, again, to fix people back to how they should have been, especially for people who may identify as transgender. So if you have the intersection of violence and people with disabilities, and then you add in maybe a person who's transgender, believes that they're really the gender not of the body they were born with, for example. How do we make sure that we're being sensitive to their trauma issues and that we're not adding any trauma to their life. Another area to think about is people who do not appear to be hurting, because not everybody who's experienced trauma are going to be throwing things, becoming aggressive, having these so-called behavior problems. They may be people who are very compliant, who go along with everything, never have a greasy wheel, never draw attention to themselves. People who, if you will, freeze or maybe disassociate, but we don't notice it because they're not causing a problem. So recognizing that the majority of people we serve probably have a trauma history, and not excluding people or taking into account people who have learned to cope with their trauma in different ways, just as a reminder.
So putting into practice, Shirley, you mentioned earlier that we would talk about in-service planning. These are some specific things that can be done. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have to start with the basics. If I don't feel safe, I'm not going to be able to move forward. So what are some things that we can put in my service plan that will help me feel both physically, emotionally safe, grounded? And that might, sometimes we can't remove the stressor. Mm-hmm. So how do I feel safer? And that might be some of the grounding techniques. Mm-hmm. That might be some things that that we can put on my plan that I can work on. Mm-hmm. I mentioned about how important it was to give back power. I mean, that I think it's many times some of the you mentioned feeling helpless. When the woman was upset about her purse, it was going back to that feeling of I don't have control over my life anymore. I don't have control over what's happening to me. So and these are not arbitrary choices, like they really don't count. You give they need to be a whole menu of things that I truly get to choose what option it is, with no consequences if I don't pick the one you want me to.
Right. And Teresa, I just wanted to give an example of safety that I had in my mind with somebody I worked with. And this person lived in a group home, I think maybe with 4 people. And for him, it was really important that his room was closest to the staff who were there during the night. So he felt like he had people there to help keep him safe. Mm-hmm. Not that anybody there that we knew of was doing anything at that time, but the history was things happen at night when many people aren't around. And so that was an example of what he needed to feel physically safe in his environment. So that's a simple thing to do, usually. But it was a great example to share today, I think.
Great. And like you said, it's something simple to do. Many times, the service plan that helps promote healing is not something complicated. It really is asking the person, what do you need to feel safe? What do you need? And then build a plan from there. And it may not be a program. Right. It may just be the simple, empowering steps. I love this thought from Judith Herman about recovery can only take place in the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. And that speaks to what an impact we can make when we serve and support trauma victims. Right. Because they're not going to be able to do it by themselves. As I mentioned earlier, trauma oftentimes happens within relationships. So it makes sense that the only way I can heal from it is within that context of relationships, probably different ones.
And that speaks very clearly to what each one of you can do, the meaning and purpose that you can have in someone's life when you're able to do this. So thank you. Another thing around service planning, and this is from Martin Seligman's work. He did Learned Helplessness and then Learned Optimism, and this is from his book in 2011 called Flourish. And he said that there's 5 elements of psychological well-being, which I think can be incorporated into service planning. Positive emotion is just having access to things that give you passive pleasure, like a good meal or going out to a movie. I like those things, So making sure that folks have access to things that give them, that passive pleasure. Engagement are having opportunities to do things that give you pleasure, but you're more engaged in them. So it may be a hobby, an art project, but actually something that you're actively engaged in. Relationships, of course, we've mentioned that healing can't occur except in the context of relationships. So really helping folks with relationships and working through that. Achievement has to do with accomplishing something, right? We all feel so much better when we can accomplish something. A lot of people that work with people with disabilities or work with people in general love to go home and mow the lawn because they can see that they achieved something really, really fast, or they love to paint or work with wood or do something where they can see the outcome of their work, because sometimes we don't see that real often, real fast. So everybody needs to feel that sense of accomplishment. And meaning, I have put stars there because according to Seligman's work, meaning kind of trumps everything else. If you have a life that's full of meaning and purpose, it can change everything. I know people that have had pretty significant behavior problems. When they found a purpose and a meaning in their life, that stuff just kind of went away. Mm-hmm. Because now they felt good about themselves. They felt good about why they were on earth and what their contributions were. So helping people find meaning, and we think of jobs as one part of that. It could be a job. It could be having a relationship, an intimate relationship with someone that you really love, and they love you back, and all that good stuff. So these are some things to keep in mind as we develop service plans for people.
And that service plan might include therapy, and my challenge is to not box in what therapy looks like or who can benefit from therapy. Oftentimes folks will think, well, if the individual communicates differently, they're not going to be able to benefit from counseling, and that's not true. Mm-hmm. It's a support that helps many, many people heal from trauma. We've been doing a lot of work here in Illinois with our rape crisis centers and now digging into working with our domestic violence programs about how to offer different types of support services, things that go beyond talk therapy that meet the needs of survivors. Mm-hmm. And so I certainly wouldn't rule out, I wouldn't assess someone's ability saying, this person can benefit, this person can't benefit. Give it a try.
And one of the frequent things I hear is, well, they can't go to counseling or therapy because they're quote-unquote nonverbal. I would say that is absolutely not true. I've done therapy with people who communicate in ways that may be a little more challenging for us to understand, and have had great success. So don't, put any boxes or assumptions around that other than that anyone can benefit from therapy. You just have to revise how you do therapy, and you have to break it down differently and be more creative. So that should be hopefully an option for a lot of people. And then we think within service planning, if you have folks who experience a lot of crises, we want to do crisis prevention. So this has to do with understanding what their triggers are. Are there ways we can avoid those? Are there anniversaries that are going to possibly lead to a crisis? It could be the anniversary of the date when one of their parents died. It could be an anniversary of something else. But we know that on this anniversary, historically, this person has had a really difficult time. We know who their favorite people are. So what if on that anniversary date we can do something that makes them feel safe and happy? One of those back to the engagement thing. Maybe they can go fishing. Maybe it's something they did with their father who's passed away, and now they can celebrate and remember the joyful times by going fishing with their favorite person on the day, because that's something they used to do with their dad. You got to work it through for each person, but that would be a possible example. And then positive identification and happiness plan. What roles are important to this person? A lot of times, we make assumptions about what people can and can't do. And, in employment programs, we typically look at, cleaning, food and filth, food and filth. But maybe the person can do them things. It doesn't mean they want to. I can do those things too, and I sure don't want to. But what role is important? We have a lot of folks who want to help other people. Maybe we can help them with a volunteer job, or some other way to help. What are some ways that would help them feel better about themselves? So we can have conversations, and there's tools that help with this. And how can we increase their sense of accomplishment and their meaning and purpose in life? And a lot of this stuff comes from Karen Harvey in her book, Trauma-Informed Behavior Interventions, What Works and What Doesn't, from 2012.
So many of these things on this slide we've talked about, and it's all in the effort of not re-traumatizing the individual. Now, granted, there's things that will happen that we can't safeguard, but there's certainly things that we can do. If you're seeing somebody, it can be as simple as the path that is taken to a certain service, that you're driving the van by a building that triggers bad memories, to take a different path. Are we, so it's not just for the individual to recognize triggers, but for us to do things differently. And always going back to the person is the expert. They know what works for them. They know what hurts, kind of back to this is what makes me happy, this is what breaks my heart, right. Those types of things. And I think sometimes the predictability, the having a schedule, some consistency, those boundaries can be very healing as well, with dealing with trauma. Then I think the last thing I want to say about this is just saying we need to pay attention to ourselves. What are we doing to be very conscious or present of how we're interacting with others.
Mm-hmm. And we know that survivors need an opportunity to tell their stories. Judith Herman says, when the truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin their recovery. Now, this doesn't mean we also go around asking people, were you sexually abused? Or this happened to you? That's not what the purpose of that is. But we have to create safe environments and safe places and ask the questions when it's the right time and by the right person so that people have the opportunity if they choose to. Staff need to understand that symptoms may reflect, or behavior may reflect an adaptation to trauma. And we really have to confront power within our organizations and our relationships, prevent violence and coercion, and really work together for change. We're going to talk a little bit about shifting our view of behavior. And frequently, if you look at this chart, we only focus on the top element, which is behavior. Under that is some really strong emotion many times. And under that is trauma. So once we identify the trauma and find out the best way to support the person, and it may be different today than in 2 months. We got to keep reevaluating all that. Then things can change. So we have to decide, do we want to manage behavior or do we want to help the person cope with trauma? Do we want to promote healing or do we want to provide consequences? We worked with a woman who said that during when she was at the day program, the van would drive by on the way to the workshop, they would drive by the school where she was sexually assaulted when she was a special ed student. And every day she would have behaviors. What do you know, right? But nobody really knew what was going on with her. Nobody asked. It was just, we're going to punish this, we're going to reward this. It was all about consequences. So we want to look at that a different way. No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster their recovery. So this is a measurement by which you can measure your behavior programs. Does this intervention take power away from this person? If it does, it does not have anything to do with recovery. It may just make things worse.
Even if you have good intentions, like
you're
trying
absolutely.
to help. We're not talking about somebody who's trying, give me your power. I'm going to, We're talking about the kind heart that in order to help that person heal, to truly help them, give them the power.
Yes, you bet. So we're going to talk about changing the climate. Lisa doesn't like the way the bus driver looks her up and down. When she tells staff, they tell her, oh, Bill's a nice guy. You shouldn't say unkind things about him. So that's kind of the frame for this thinking activity that we have. So one possibility is to identify this problem as acting out, and we create a service plan to address her behavior because she's always talking about Bill and always telling on Bill, and Bill doesn't do anything. He's nice. Why, he even bought her a present for Christmas. The result of this approach is we're punishing her survival behavior and her trying to speak up where there is no possible way this will support healing.
As you go back to what you said earlier, Shirley, that the perpetrator is most likely to be someone that the individual knows and likes, which means there's a good likelihood that it's someone I know and like too if I'm on staff.
Absolutely.
So I maybe think, Bill's a great guy. How could you say that? That's why he's a victim.
Exactly. So we're going to kind of flip that whole picture around. And these are some opportunities we might have. We could initiate an investigation. We could change the bus route. We could report this to Bill's supervisor. We could talk with Lisa about her feelings. We could ask Lisa what she thinks should happen. But another thing, and this happens so often, if we hear somebody blaming Lisa, whether it's in the restroom, in the office, or in the hallway, we can intervene and say, we may not tell the whole story.
And actually, there's not one of these that is correct. It may be several of these things.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the trauma-informed approach, there's really 3 key elements according to SAMHSA again. Realize the prevalence of trauma, which I hope you all know now. Recognize how trauma affects individuals within your program, your organization, your system, including your own workforce. And responding by putting this knowledge into practice. So this little screen here talks about if we were going to come in and look at trauma-informed organizational elements, they might include these things. We actually have and are updating a trauma-informed assessment tool, and it would look at these different types of things, relationships, service planning, environmental factors, etc., just to give you a clue. I know we're going to get to you for questions, so we're going to kind of tie this up and let you ask questions. These are some resources that might be helpful. Illinois Imagines has a variety of resources on their website, including some webinars and all kinds of toolkits, and it's almost overwhelming. There's so much. The Accessing Safety website, one of the resources they have is a practical guide for creating trauma-informed disability, domestic violence, and sexual assault organizations.
And just an FYI, that website is right this moment under construction.
Oh.
And so if you go to it, it's not going to come up today, but give it a little time and go back to that website, and the resource will be there.
Okay, cool. And this is the SAMHSA website where you can get a lot of information on trauma-informed care. This is Karen Harvey's book. We've mentioned, had 2 or 3 pages from that. And then Wellness Recovery Action Planning, I don't know the website, but if you put that in Google, you'll get a whole bunch of stuff on it. Yeah. And in closing, we just want to say this. You have relationships with people with disabilities, many of you on a daily basis. Hope changes everything. When people know that we're learning about this, we want to help with this, we're going to do everything we can to help them feel safe, empowered, and connected. Hope changes everything, and we don't really have a right to take hope away from people, but we can help people have hope because healing is always possible.
And I think it's so important to just emphasize that, it's all about you. What you do truly does matter. How you respond. You could be the person may have disclosed their history of trauma to 50 other people and didn't get a response that was helpful. But how you respond could make that difference and change that path, change that future.
Yeah. And what you do really matters, and who you are really matters. So we hope that this has been helpful, and we are ready to take questions. And while you do that, Sarah's going to read them to us, but we want to show you our last slide, I think. What happened? Just a second here. So that if you want any contact information, you'll have it here from myself as well as for Teresa. And we will just wait and hear as Sarah reads any questions that are there. I think we have 7 or 8 minutes left, Sarah?
Yep, we sure do. You guys, Shirley and Teresa, thank you so much. That was a really informative webinar, gave us lots of information and things to think about. If we have any more questions, please type those into your question option there. Something that I wonder if you two could speak about just really quickly is around education on abuse and neglect and sexuality for people who have cognitive, intellectual, developmental disabilities. There's not much education going on, and I feel that this has left people in quite a vulnerable position not to have the information to know that I don't like that, I don't have to have that happen. I understand what's happening here, and I know what to do about it.
Sarah, that's a great question, and you're right that lack of critical information is one of the major risk factors for violence in the lives of people with disabilities. You're absolutely right. That Illinois Imagines website actually has free curriculum that people can download, print, and use. There's an education guide for adults with all different kinds of disabilities. There's a picture supplement guide which goes with that education guide that can be also downloaded and printed and used. We can have a few that we can ship if we get requests for that in hard copy. So we're strong proponents of that. We also think that it works really well for educators at victim service agencies like rape crisis centers. They have educators on staff who really understand the dynamics of the power differential when sexual abuse does happen, sexual assault, and to have them come into disability agencies and co-train with self-advocates and staff. It seems to be a perfect marriage. And then when somebody does need services, they can get them to those services very quickly. Of course, education can be done also by, families and schools and adult service providers. So we're strong proponents of that. It's really hard to tell, especially if you're over compliant and always taught to do what you're told to do by no matter who tells you. And since the relationships are people we know and trust, we think education is critical. And then also having, looking at some of the other environmental factors, like have we taught people that we can touch them all the time without their permission? That leads to increased risk for sexual violence because we do it all the time. So are we asking people before intimate care activities if we may help them? Are we teaching them privacy and respect and dignity for their private body parts, for example? there's a kind of a wraparound approach to that we use for risk reduction, but you've certainly raised a couple of them that are really important. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm thinking, just to clarify the education guide, it's 19 separate lessons. It could be more than that depending upon the pace of your group. And it surely said that, the best formula is to include someone from Victim Services, someone from the Disability Agency, and a self-advocate, where you could have a peer support group that is just self-advocate. The other resource that's available there is a parent-guardian guide, and that was developed after the education guide as disability service providers were implementing the program. There was some pushback from parents and guardians saying, we want to know what you're talking about, or I'm not sure, an education group is the right idea. And so we wanted to not push them aside, but to engage them, because when parents and guardians or loved ones understand about the risk, then they can be of help. So there's also a module that will help that. So if you work with parents and guardians, this would be stuff, things like, if something should happen to your loved one, how do you respond? Family members oftentimes get very angry at what happened. They blame themselves. They don't know how to respond. And there's tools in there for them, too, in their own recovery.
Fantastic.
Other resource.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Okay, I was just going to say another resource that's in there is a guide for empowerment groups, which would be groups of people with disabilities. We prefer that they're gender specific, so women with disabilities or men with disabilities, where they can learn peer support strategies for supporting each other and having safer environments and speaking up and learning everything they can. So
fantastic. I'm going to read out 3 comments to you. Do you have, the first one would be, do you have techniques for working with people who are nonverbal in a therapeutic setting? The other one is just looking for some information around someone who's choosing to stay with an abusive partner, even though it is quite dysfunctional, and what education there is available for them around the cycle of abuse. And another comment here was Dave Hinsberger, who has also done a lot of work around this and has written some wonderful resources to help in understanding what people may have experienced.
Start with the last one. I love Dave Hinsberger. He has amazing tools. One of them I really like is the Ethics of Touch, which is a program on touching and for staff around touching folks and having boundaries. I love all of Dave's work. I read everything he has. Buy them for other people. He has great things. So I think we will add him on our resource list, because I didn't do that because we were focusing specifically on trauma. In terms of working with people who, quote unquote, are nonverbal in a therapeutic setting, done that many, many times. We take the typical approach to therapy for people that have experienced trauma, and we revise it based on that person. So we may use music, we may use art, we may use role play and without words. There's a lot of different things you can do, and it all surrounds that person. And sometimes it takes a while to figure it out. We use a lot of pictures with people. I worked with one person for about a year with her and her mom with anatomically correct models in order to kind of teach the concept of no. And she signed a few words, and no was one of them. And we met once a week and did role plays and videos and different things. And I'll never forget the day that we were doing something with the dolls, and we got in her space, and she signed no, no, no 3 times in a row and had this look on her face like, don't you dare. And her mom and I both cried because it was like, oh, my gosh, she got it. But there's many, many ways. We have to assume that every person we work with has resources. I believe every one of us that was born with resources. Now, we manifest them a little differently, may look a little differently, and part of our job is to be creative and really see the beauty and the hope and the resilience and strength in every person, and then it's up to us to figure out the best way to communicate with them. So we could do a whole thing on counseling and therapeutic techniques for people with intellectual disabilities, some which may not have a voice.
Well, and I think about the story that you shared with me once, Shirley, about the woman who was able to watch a video, and she could relate to that, and you could tell, even though she couldn't express with words, with unspoken words, it was very healing. It was obvious of that. So and I know that's true with myself. There's times I go to a friend with a problem, and I don't want advice. I don't want you to fix me. I just want you to listen to me. So we all need different things. So it is listening to how that. I want to address the question about the staying in the abusive relationship. First of all, I'm going to put aside mandatory reporting. Okay, so I'm taking that off the shelf. And so I'm talking about any individual who chooses to stay in an abusive relationship. Many times, as I said, as outsiders relationship, we want to pull them out of that relationship. We want them to be safe, where in essence, we know for a fact that when a victim is preparing to leave, in the process of leaving, or soon after they've left, that is the most dangerous time. That's when most fatalities occur. So our efforts to yank someone out of a relationship is very, very dangerous. The victim knows better than anyone else what is the safest choice to make, and that may take time for that person to get to that decision if it ever comes. And the other part of it is, going back to education, I may not know what is a healthy versus an unhealthy relationship. One of our team members on Illinois Imagines, when we were creating a handout called, Who to Date, or is that the name of it? What was it? Yeah, Who to Date. We all started joking about it. I said, man, I wish I'd had this information 30 years ago, and had that time, because we don't talk about. So that would be that. It might be an issue of not having the information, or it may be it's the safest thing to do to stay in that, or someplace in between.
And let me add another thing. A lot of people that I've worked with in that situation, they have learned over time that their value is in their legs, is in between their legs. That's the only value they have is within this relationship, and it may be, sexual. But if you think about those 5 elements for psychological well-being, if we help people recognize their strengths, come up with some accomplishments, find some meaning in their life. And this can take, several months. I've worked with 2 or 3 people who were actually prostituting themselves, fully competent and able to make that decision, and, it was very difficult for staff. But when we started working with her trauma issues, and she started finding out that maybe things weren't the way she thought they were, that maybe she did have value, that maybe she was a person that had contributions to make in the community, things started shifting. She started doing volunteer work. She got some new goals and dreams in her life, and things started shifting, and she started changing, and she doesn't prostitute herself anymore. Another person I worked with, we had her boyfriend would take all of her money. I mean, she was always broke all the time, and it was like, here comes Social Security check, here it goes. And one of the things that we did with her, she always talked about this one soap opera. So I had mine, because I never knew how to tape anything. I had my daughter tape it for me, and when the kids went to bed at night, I would watch this soap opera. So I went to what is most important to her, this soap opera. So I would watch it at night, and we would have conversations about it. And usually on, I don't know, it's the only soap opera I watched, but there was a character on there who took advantage of people in all of her relationships. She was very much take. We started having these conversations. She figured out, oh my gosh, that's what my boyfriend's doing. He's just like her. He's manipulating me. He's doing, and she, by golly, she said, I'm not putting up with that. And she came to it all on her own, And I had to then go to therapy to get off being addicted to that soap opera. But each person's going to be different. But I think there's ways that we can help people if we just think a little bit outside the box, and because telling what you're doing now doesn't work, try something else, right? When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So, there's always hope. So I hope that's been somewhat helpful. I know we're out of time. I did want to put this last slide up for you, Sarah.
Oh, thanks. Yes. What we'll do, we'll email the slide presentation to everyone that registered for the webinar, and the recording of this webinar will be posted on the CQL website. On the CQL website, also, we have our conference coming up in St. Louis, Missouri in October, the 20th and 21st. And we also have some other related webinars around behavioral health. One will be July 1st on wellness planning and recovery, August 5th on employment, and the 2nd of September, using personal outcome measures in recovery. Shirley and Teresa, I just want to thank you so much for giving this information and for caring. It really means a lot. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended, and we look forward to meeting again. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.